Troubleshooting AutoCAD Map 3D ArcSDE FDO Connections. My name's Katie Jakes. I'm the Global Technical Lead for Product Support at Autodesk. Today's overview is we'll cover the top ArcSDE FDO issues. We'll go over troubleshooting the issues, specifically with the FDO connection, also talk about crashing, error reports, and Autodesk product support and available resources. To start, we're going to talk about troubleshooting ArcSDE connection issues. When we're creating ArcSDE connections, the things that we need to be concerned about are how to get started, so what files need to go in what places to make the connection work, the DLLs that are required to make this successful connection, instance versus direct connection property types, and customer error reports. The supported versions for ArcSDE connections are ArcSDE 9.1, ArcSDE 9.2, ArcSDE 9.3, and ArcSDE 9.3.1, which is new for 2011. The 9.3.1 version is available as either 32-bit or 64-bit provider for Windows. For previous versions and on Linux, it's available in 32-bit only. The 64-bit support is available only with the 64-bit ESRI ArcSDE 9.3 client libraries. So you can see here that for version 9.1, the DLLs actually had the 9.1 numbers inside the name. And for versions 9.2 through 9.3.1, actually there is no version numbers called out specifically within the DLL files. So these files are often, we would generate a high volume of calls on where do we find these files. These files are actually not ones that are supplied by the Autodesk team or that come installed out of the box with AutoCAD Map 3D in any of the versions. These are proprietary files that are owned as part of the ArcSDE client libraries and will need to be copied from those install folders of some sort of ESRI Arc desktop software in order for you to leverage them using AutoCAD Map 3D. So let's talk about the two different types of ArcSDE connections. So it used to be that we only supported the instance or ArcSDE service type connections, which leverages a port number and a service name, etc., etc. New back in 2010, we started supporting direct connections. So let's talk about the differences between the two. So the instance and ArcSDE service type is the most common. The ArcSDE service, which is also known as the application server or three-tiered architecture, basically conveys some data between GIS applications in a database. And we support the two types of databases on Oracle and SQL Server. It leverages a TCP/IP service name and port number. So tools that the ArcSDE service is using to listen to the connections. These are specifically dedicated for ArcSDE. The default name is typically ESRI_SDE, but your database manager can go ahead and change this, and if they have changed it, you need to be aware so that you can make a connection. The default port number is 5151, but this can also be changed by your database manager. The services can be started within the service tools in Windows Management, and you can see the icon here. For a direct connection, it means we're directing connectly from a client application to a geodatabase. The communication between the database and the client takes place via this direct connect driver and not through an ArcSDE service. And most of the processes that would have taken place in the server are now going to take place specifically on the client machines. So from within AutoCAD Map 3D, we actually don't get a choice of how we want to connect to ArcSDE. All of the information that I've just talked about, this is all set up within the ArcSDE environment. So the database manager is going to be the person that's going to designate which type of connection they want to leverage to use the ArcSDE environment. And these same two types of services are how you would access it from the ESRI side of things as well if you're using one of their desktop softwares. So to set up your system for a instance or ArcSDE service connection for 9.1, you want to make sure that you have the three 9.1 DLLs, which is PE91, SDE91, and SG91, inside the Program Files folder for your AutoCAD Map 3D software. Whether it's 2008, 2009, 2010, or even 2011, there's a folder off that install folder called FDO and then a subfolder called bin. You want those to be located in there. So you're going to copy them from your ESRI program files into the Map 3D program files. You also want to add entries into your Windows System 32 drivers folder so that you can use server names as opposed to having to use the IP addresses. And if you have trouble connecting, you can add a new line in your drivers that looks like this down here, which is an IP address down here on the bottom, and ArcSDE host. Very similar for setting up connections for ArcSDE 9.2. The DLL files are named something slightly different, but they're going to go in the same location that the 9.1 ones would have gone into. And again, the entries into your Windows System 2 drivers are going to be for pretty much identical, and the same thing with if you're having trouble connecting at all. So a direct connection, here's how we'd set up for SQL Server, and all this information that I'm actually going over right now is verbatim inside the help documentation. So if you open up your AutoCAD Map 3D environment, do a search for Direct Connect or even SDE, you'll see options for Direct Connect versus Instant. You can follow along through there. So the point, though, the big difference between the direct connections and the instance is that you actually have to set up the connections to the underlying databases. And how you actually access that data is going to be slightly different than if it's an instance. So we're going to install the SQL native client software on the client machine where you're running Map 3D. You're going to open up the SQL Server port, for example, 1433, on the database machine firewall, set the SQL Server database to support Remote Connect, and then test the connection. You're going to copy different DLL files in addition to the existing SDE, SG, and PE files that we saw in the last slides. And these are actually only available if you have the ArcSDE Software Developer Kit software. So these aren't going to be in a basic install of, let's say, ArcView or ArcGIS Desktop. So you're going to copy these 5 additional DLL files, and then you might have to do some adjustments to the connection parameters. The server name, you're going to specify the server name or the IP address, however you'd prefer to connect. Instance name, it's going to probably be the default is the most common, which is MS SQL Server. And then username and password for the database. The data store name, for example, it might be SDE, and then the version. And it defaults to the root version if you don't specify the version. For Oracle connections, it's going to be something really similar. The DLL files are slightly different, and for the most part, all the connection parameters are the same as well. And again, you're installing the Oracle client software on the client machine wherever you're running Map 3D. You're opening the port, and then in Oracle's instance, you're going into the Oracle Net Manager tool to set up the TNS names to get to the target database. And then we're making sure that we test the connection. You can use SQL+. So a common question we get is, do I need the 9.1 DLLs or do I need the 9.2 DLLs? Well, it really depends on your version of SDE. So you actually want to check your SDE server for this version information. It also depends on what version of AutoCAD Map 3D you're running. So Map 2008, for example, only supports ArcSDE 9.1 connections. But there's an FTO provider that comes out of the box with Map 3D 2008. That supports the 9.1. But you can go up and update it with an open source version that can enable connections to ArcSDE 9.2 as well. You will not be able to connect to version 9.3 or 9.3.1 from Map 2008. Map 2009 supports ArcSDE 9.1 and 9.2. 2010 supports 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3, and the latest and greatest 2011 supports 9.1, 9.2, 9.3, and 9.3.1. How are these DLLs used within MAP? The loader component verifies the presence of the ArcSDE 9.2 component first. So for example, it looks for SDE.dll. If it's present, it will use the ArcSDE provider 9.2 DLL that you'll see that's installed out of the box inside that bin folder in your program files. And then it connects using the 9.2 components. If the component's not present, meaning you're not using the 9.2 version, you're using 9.1, it's going to try to load the 9.1 components, so SDE 9.1.dll, for example, and then use the ArcSDE provider 9.1.dll. And if neither of the two components is present, the operation will fail and it will show you some sort of error message with an exception indicating that the necessary client components for SDE are missing. Some known limitations and workarounds. So the FTO provider for ArcSDE must abide by limitations of the SDE technology. So we're limited to how SDE is designed. The ArcSDE API doesn't support the following functions that are found in the ArcObjects API and the newer ArcGIS Server API. So we don't support advanced geometries, such as curves and ellipses. We don't support relationships, we don't support topology, we don't support networks, we don't support linear referencing. And if ArcSDE encounters curved segments, it will automatically tessellate them, or basically digitize or segment them so that they're no longer a solid line. So you may want to go in and do some polyline edits prior to that inside your SDE environment so that Map3D can read it. There's also no support for raster files that are stored within an ArcSDE database. So if you have a raster database inside SDE, there's no way for Map3D to recognize that. So what you must do is move the raster files to a Windows folder so that Map3D can recognize them, and you'll leverage the raster FDO provider instead. Some common issues when making connections. So while making connections, you may run into an error message: the specified credentials aren't valid, or the provider is unable to establish a connection. So things to check, ways to troubleshoot. Do you have the correct server name? If your server name doesn't work, try your IP address of the SDE server instead. Do you have the correct instance name, aka port number? Default, remember, is 5151. Is it a direct connection? Then make sure those additional DLL files we talked about between SQL and Oracle are in the right locations. Also, it may be the different instance names, so there's no port number in this case. Correct username and password. You want to make sure that your SDE user permissions are working, and if not, try with an admin account or configure a new user and test that account as well. Check the DLLs. Did you add the correct ones that correspond to your SDE version? So are you trying to use 9.1 DLLs, but you're using a 9.2 database? Those are things that you want to make sure you're aware of. So let's talk about bringing in your features using your ArcSDE service. So we're going to go through a demonstration in a moment here that's going to show how to leverage a connection and bring in that data. And this is from an ArcSDE service or an instance. So we have a port number, we have a service name, we have username and password. We're not using a direct connection. So we'll go through the process. This is just a step-by-step process that, again, is verbatim inside the help environment, but it just goes through the workflow of where to push, where to connect, go to the connection name. And there's actually a few free SDE sites out there that are open for the public. A couple different universities have them in different states. So that might be an environment for you to test their connections first if you're having trouble with your own connections. To make a connection to an ArcSDE database, click the Data button within the task pane, connect to data, choose the ArcSDE connection. We're going to be using a public server that the state of Utah is putting out. They are using the default instance. The login credentials are AGRC for both username and password. You can choose to remember the password so you won't have to type everything in next time around. And our data store is going to be whatever they have in their list here. Choose Connect. I'm going to take a moment to connect to the service since this is a public site. Depends on how many hits they're getting at the time and what their server specs can handle. It's going to go through and it's going to read all the schema of the different features within their database. I know they have quite a few inside of here. And then we can choose to actually connect and bring in whatever features we'd like within their database. We will not have read-write permission for this. We'll only have read permission since we are not owners of the database, and this is just a user account, not an editor account. Now that we've made the connection to the Utah ArcSDE database, you can see that we have the different feature sources that we can choose to add in. We'll go ahead and add in the habitat of a moose. Seems like a fun thing. And you can see that the feature is brought in. At this point, we're able to work with the data as we are with any GIS data. We can look at the attribute information of it. and we can actually export it out to CAD features as well if we do want to do any editing with it. Customer error reports are a useful tool in order for the team here at Autodesk to identify issues within the products. So nearly all the crashes that you encounter within the programs that you're working with should end up with this customer error report. And you can see here's an example of an AutoCAD one. The customer error reports are essential for our development team so that they can know where the source of the problems are. It actually gives them information about at what point in the code did the problem occur, and if there's common themes that are happening within certain features, they're going to try to address those in either service packs or the next release of the software. These error reports are also sometimes helpful for the product support team, but we need to make sure that you include an email address so that we can locate that error report within the database. There's additional troubleshooting and support request information resources that are available to you besides just Autodesk product support. So within our .com environment, we have a knowledge base which has technical solutions inside of there about how to make connections, how to troubleshoot certain things. And there's also discussion groups, and specifically there is a Map3D discussion groups, so it's all focused on Map3D environment. Externally, we have Augie forums, Google searches, various blogs. For example, I just started a new blog called Map Tech, which is for the geospatial products map and map guide. And there's Microsoft Knowledge databases, and then any local language forums and groups that may exist as well. In summary, today we covered the ArcSDE FDO provider, some of the top ArcSDE issues that we run into when leveraging the FDO provider, and troubleshooting connection issues, specifically with instance and direct connections. Thank you very much.